We have wrapped up the prophets, correct? That's where I have in my notes that we are. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And first of all, here we're going to introduce the writings that we did not cover in the historical narrative portion of our study together last semester. So we're going to cover the poetical books. We're going to cover a couple of other books as well. And just to lay some groundwork, some background work for our understanding of these books that are organized under the writings in the Old Testament. One of the things that we're going to see is poetry is a consistent literary form within the writings. And Hebrew poetry is not like English poetry. We think of English poetry and we think roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. And there's not only a rhythm of sound. There's a cadence to it, but also then it's based generally on rhyme. Hebrew poetry is generally based instead on rhythm of thought. Okay, is based on rhythm of thought. And the fundamental, the fundamental building block of Hebrew poetry is parallelism. Okay, is parallelism. So the way that Hebrew poetry builds on itself instead of on its sound, on its rhyming, there is a certain cadence to the thinking that goes. And we'll see a couple of different types of parallelism that are important for us to be able to identify some and understand to see how the lines, 2 lines or 3 lines sometimes are related to one another. And the first is synonymous parallelism, where both lines say the same thing. In synonymous parallelism, both lines say the same thing. And you guys can open up to Psalms and we'll look at an example of each of these. Not that they're terribly difficult concepts to grasp, but I think it's good to be able to see synonymous parallelism is exemplified, for instance, in Psalm 1, verse 2. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. So the two ideas of those lines they're saying essentially the same thing, right? One reiterates the second reiterates the first in declaring the feelings about the righteous man, the understanding of the righteous man as it pertains to God's law, how he feels about it. So in synonymous parallelism, the two parallel lines say the same thing. Oftentimes as well, you'll see what's called antithetical parallelism. And so anti means against. So you have the same point made in opposite expression. You have the same point made in the 2 lines, only they're expressed in an opposite way. Take a look at Psalm 1, verse 6. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Well, what's the point there? Both lines are saying that it's good to walk in the way of the righteous, right? It's better to be righteous than wicked. And the 2 concepts, the 2 lines say the same thing, but it talks about it from opposite angles. God knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked, the opposite, will perish. these two lines, these two types of lines in particular, can often be really helpful for us when in studying what Hebrew words mean, because you'll have the words parallel each other within the line, oftentimes word for word. And then we can often see, okay, these two words are synonyms, or these two words are antonyms based on their relationship within Hebrew poetry and the parallelism of thought. But the two lines here, the couplets, and sometimes you'll see triplets, so 3 lines that work together, will oftentimes work to say the same thing in a similar way, or the same thing making the same point with the opposite expression. So be on the lookout for those types of parallelism. You'll also see synthetic parallelism, where the second line builds on the first. Look over at Psalm 3, the 3rd Psalm, and the 4th verse. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. You can see there how logically the one builds on the next. And we may look at that and say, well, yeah, it's just like completing a sentence. And then you would understand synthetic parallelism exactly. The ideas are related, but one builds on the other. It completes the thought. We may also see emblematic parallelism, where the second line expands on the symbolism of the first. Look at Psalm 42. In verse 1. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. So you see there how the second line describes or explains the picture, the emblem of the first. That's the idea there with emblematic parallelism. And there's one more type of parallelism that we call formal parallelism. You can look at the 2nd Psalm and the 6th verse, Psalm 2:6. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And that is, formal parallelism becomes kind of a catch-all that explains or describes other kinds of parallelism that we're not really sure how to classify, is really what that does. So there is a formal set of 2 lines in that formal parallelism, but they just go together. So rhythm of thought, we're going to discuss some other things that go on in Hebrew poetry, but rhythm of thought is the fundamental building block. It's what really drives Hebrew poetry. What really drives Hebrew poetry. There is also rhythm of sound. This is more difficult for us in English to see, because obviously the rhythm of sound in Hebrew, in the original writings, rests on the Hebrew. You can find John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, did translate the Psalms in English poetical form. So obviously his goal wasn't necessarily as directly literal translation as he could make, but he takes some poetic license. But I do like sometimes to pull that out and read through the way that he translated some of the Psalms in English poetic fashion. But there is a certain rhythm of sound that can come as well, and there are a couple of different ways that this could be accomplished. And the first is via an acrostic. In an acrostic, the lines of the poem begin with successive letters of the alphabet. And the best example of this, you can turn to Psalm 119. You're probably familiar with this. This is a great big acrostic. Psalm 119 is broken up into groups of 8 verses, and each verse, each line for each 8 verses starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So if you have an Old Testament, or if you have a Bible that's broken up with headings or anything like that, you will probably see Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, as you work your way down through the psalm. And the reason that that's labeled that way is because each of the words, or not every word, each of the lines in that section of the psalm start with Aleph, and then each of the lines in the next section of the psalm start with Beit. So he works his way down. Sometimes it just goes Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, works its way through the Hebrew alphabet. But it would have been helpful for memory. Remember that most people wouldn't have had access to written Bible or written material. So much of this you would have to memorize. And beyond that, we're going to see that something like the book of Psalms is the hymn book for the nation Israel. So people would need to be able to remember it to participate in the worship that was going on with the book of the Psalms. So there are a lot of ways that go on here that are mnemonic devices. There are lots of mnemonic devices within the poetry. So an acrostic would be one way that you would see this rhythm of sound. You would also see oftentimes alliteration. Consonant sounds at the beginning of the word. Constant consonant sounds at the beginning of the word. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. How many pickled peppers did Peter Piper pick? Yep, so that's alliteration. Sally sells seashells by the seashores. If I can say it right. Sally sells seashells by the seashore. That's another example of alliteration. And that would come into Hebrew poetry, sometimes used in Hebrew poetry. Oftentimes, if this is happening, a good commentary will point this out, because again, oftentimes what the author is trying to do is draw attention to a section or to a major point or a major place. And so there is sometimes emphasis brought out via alliteration, via that rhythm of sound. So a good commentator oftentimes will pull that out and point that out when that's happening. Assonance is another example, and it is a little more broad than alliteration. It's repeated sounds utilized in words. That wouldn't, you know what? I don't know. To be honest, I'm not sure. Trying to think of a Mississippi versus Mississippi State has a lot of sounds, so you'd have assonance there that would draw attention again to that. So repeated sounds that are utilized in words. Paronomasia, wordplay between words that sound alike. We see that Antiochus Epiphanes was oftentimes called by his opponents Antiochus Epimanes. Antiochus Epiphanes means Antiochus, who is God manifest, and Epimanes means crazy. And so that would be a play of paronomasia, where there's wordplay between words that sound alike. Wordplay between words that sound alike. So oftentimes you will have in the Old Testament paronomasia where there's a play on a name or a play on an idea. Excuse me. Onomatopoeia are words that sound like what they represent. In English, whoosh. boom, pow, Batman words. If you remember the old Batman television show where they had the bat, pow, zap, zing, those are onomatopoeia. Barbarian is onomatopoeic. To the Romans, they all sounded like they were saying bar, 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 so they're barbarians. An example in Hebrew would be the word ruach. Sounds like wind, or is thought of to sound like breath passing by. And ruach is the Hebrew word for wind, for spirit, those types of things. So that's onomatopoeia. One final rhythm of sound that you may see, and we've pointed this out, we'll continue to point this idea out, the idea of inclusion, or sometimes you'll see inclusio. You have repeated words or lines or ideas or concept at the beginning and end of a section. Repeated ideas, repeated lines, repeated statements at the beginning and the end of a section. You can see, since we were in Psalm 119 last, Psalm 118 starts with, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his loving kindness is everlasting." It wraps with, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his loving kindness is everlasting." The psalm is about the goodness of the Lord and his loving kindness, and the call to be thankful for that. So you have this repetition of ideas, words, lines at the beginning and end of a section. So these are the basic building blocks of Hebrew poetry, things that we should be on the lookout for. We should also be on the lookout for the character of these writings. So we talked about how the prophets work together. Right? We said the prophets come and they tell the people, you're not following the law. If you continue to not obey the law, then God is going to bring judgment. And then if you obey, God will bring blessing. And then they ultimately look forward to the time when God would bring restoration to the people. The law, the Torah, is God's instruction to man, or to the nation Israel, and how he expects them to function as his holy nation. Well, the writings work together as well. The theme of the writings, by and large, is human life in relation to God. Its basic characteristic gives emphasis to the individual godly man. So it explains to us, how does the godly man function? How does he work? How does he live in light of the Lord? There are some things that we'll see consistently within the writings. In the first, we'll be given patterns for prayer and for praise. So we'll see something of what a godly man's prayers look like, a godly man's praise of the Lord. We'll see a lot of that in Psalms. We'll gain some insight into God's work in the world. How is God at work? The book of Job deals with God's work in the world. Proverbs talks a good bit about it. Ecclesiastes, there's a good bit of insight given into how does God function, just generally speaking, within the world. We can draw lessons from God's created order, observing how God has made things to work and given us lessons to learn from that. The response of the godly to God's ways. How ought we to respond when we learn how God works within creation? We have models of the devotion of God's people. We see devoted people, people who are devoted to the Lord, and what that ought to look like for us. The setting for the writings is we understand that Israel is waiting for the kingdom. They're waiting for the Lord to come and rule, to set up his governance over the earth. And the writings indicate how the righteous individual should act while watching and waiting. So how does the godly man conduct himself while waiting for the Lord to come and to establish his kingdom? The nature of our relationship to the kingdom is a little different, but we're not so out of this. Position. We are waiting for the return of the Lord. We look forward to when Christ will come and he will set up his rule and reign on earth and the kingdom. So there is a great deal for us to learn from these books as well. Mm-hmm. Yep. We're going to find out the things that 2 Peter tells us to diligently pursue are not so very different from the things that these other books tell us to pursue as well. The character traits are the same. Well, yeah, funny how that works, huh? All right, we're going to start with the book of Psalms. Before we get into the wisdom literature, wisdom will be another major theme. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. First, the book of Psalms. By way of introduction, the title of the book is the Hebrew word Tehillim. And that word means praises. In the Septuagint, we have a book called Psalms because they're songs. Songs accompanied by the plucking of strings, to be more exact, more specific. But that gives us a good idea of what the book of Psalms is all about. It's about the praise that the nation Israel was to sing to the Lord. And the songs that they sang to pronounce that praise. By way of author, usually we can say the author was and fill in the blank, but we have about 2/3 of the authors of the book of Psalms identified. David wrote 73, Moses 1, Solomon a couple, Asaph 12, the sons of Korah 10, Haman 1, Ethan 1. So we see the Psalms spread out a little bit. You can see who wrote which Psalms in your syllabus there. I'll leave that to you to look up if you are particularly interested. The date of the book of Psalms, there's a pretty wide date range. 1410 BC is probably the earliest of our Psalms. Moses wrote Psalm 90. It is a Psalm of Moses. The last of the Psalms was written after the Restoration, so 450 BC. Psalm 126, written after the people are back into the land. So what we can take from this is we really span the entirety of Old Testament history for all intents and purposes. We cover a pretty good chunk of time as we consider these Psalms. By way of organization of the Psalms, we have 5 books. They're organized into 5 books. 1 to 41, 42 to 72, 73 to 89, 90 to 106, 106 to 150. So what you have with the book of Psalms is really a 5-volume book. That may or may not be intended to mirror another 5-volume book. What other 5-volume book have we talked about in our surveys here. We've talked about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So there are some who have sought out a connection between that to say, okay, is there some relationship between these? I tend to think that maybe there was some symbolic significance of having 5, but a good deal of the scholastic study that's going on within Psalms today, people are trying to figure out, is there some major theme between book 1 or in book 1 and book 2 and book 3 and book 4 and book 5? And then there's some thought book 1 is primarily Davidic, and then the Seam Psalms are also generally Davidic Psalms or about David or the Messianic line. So there's actually a fair bit of study going on as to how books 1 through 5 are related. So if you're interested, there's literature out there to do some reading on those. You can take a look at the chart here, the basic Psalms, or basic types of Psalms. You have 3 basic categorizations of Psalms. The first that is listed here is the Psalm of Remembrance, or a lament psalm. And these psalms of lament remind God that the author is in trouble. You can see it comes from the Hebrew word zakar, that means to remember, or to cause to remember, or to remind. The idea of this type of psalm is to remind someone that God is in trouble, and we call them lament psalms, or a psalm of remembrance. There are also yada psalms. Yada means to acknowledge, and these psalms give thanksgiving. They declare praises. They publicly acknowledge that God has answered one's petition. Lament psalms, psalms of thanksgiving or declarative praise, and finally, psalms of praise, Hallel psalms. Psalms that are to praise, they are descriptive praise. They extol God for who He is. They talk about here the character of God. So an acknowledgement psalm says, God has done this for me. He's answered my prayers. This praise psalm, this psalm of Hallel, is descriptive praise. God is great, for He has created the world and has demonstrated His faithfulness to the nation Israel. So these are descriptive praises. These are descriptive praises. Now, as we consider each of these types of psalms, you can take a look at the form of each type of psalm, and you're going to see, if not completely consistent every single time, a general pattern that these types of psalms follow. This will help as you look to study the psalm, to teach it, or even just to understand it, when you kind of understand what you're looking for, when you have a pretty good idea of what each section is aiming to do. You can take a look at Psalm 13 for the lament psalm, for an example of a lament psalm. And again, these aren't necessarily hard and fast rules. Not that every single psalm of each type follows this exact structure. But when you have a general type of psalm and you have a general blueprint for what that psalm looks like, a lot of times the author will break the pattern in order to, again, draw your attention to something in particular. But generally, this is what it will look like. There's an address. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? So that's in Psalm 13:1. The psalmist addresses the Lord. How long will you hide your face from me? So the next step then is he gives the lament. How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? So he lays out the situation before the Lord. He calls on the name of the Lord. How long, O Lord, will you forget me? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? He lays out his lament. It's as if God has forgotten him. It's as if God is hiding his face from him. He takes counsel in his soul, having sorrow in his heart. He's sorrowful because his enemy is exalted over him. His enemy is over him and is strengthened over him. Then there is generally a confession of trust. Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. The psalmist confesses that he trusts the Lord and makes petition to him. Consider and answer me. Enlighten my eyes. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am taken. He makes petition. He says in verse 5, here's the trust here, but I have trusted in your loving kindness, and my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. And then a promise to praise or declare the praise of the Lord. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So those are the general elements. Those are the elements that you'll generally find in a lament psalm. He'll address the Lord. He'll lay out his lament before the Lord. He'll say, this is what's making me sad. This is what is bringing me distress. The psalmist will generally confess that he trusts the Lord and make petition to the Lord to intercede on his behalf. And then he promises to thank the Lord, to praise the Lord after the Lord has indeed interceded or intercessed. Come over to Psalm 116 for the declarative praise. A psalm then of declarative praise. And remember, we said that the psalm of declarative praise is the praise of one who has received God's blessing. And he declares the praise of the Lord. You have a list there of the lament psalms as well, the individual laments and national laments under section number 2 there. Oh, I changed my mind. Not Psalm 116. Look at Psalm 30. This is the one that I have notes for here. The first element that we see in a declarative psalm, one of these psalms of praise, of declarative praise, is that the psalmist proclaims praise to the Lord, as makes sense in calling it a declarative praise. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have lifted me up and have not let my enemies rejoice over me. You see in verse 4, sing praise to God, you as godly ones, and give thanks to his holy name. There is a declaration of praise and a call to praise on account of what God has done. And oftentimes then the psalmist will give an introductory statement that summarizes what God has done. Pick up in verse 2. O Lord my God, I cried out to you for help, and you healed me. O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol, and you have kept me alive, that I would not go down to the pit. Skip down to verse 5. Read verse 4. Sing praise to the Lord, you his godly ones, to give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, and his praise is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. So you have then the introductory statement. This is what God has done. He has healed me. He took me from death's doorstep and delivered me from that. And then oftentimes there's a greater report of the deliverance that's given. Look at verses 6 through 9 here. Now as for me, I said in my prosperity, I will never be moved. O Lord, by your favor you have made my mountain to stand strong. You hid your face, and I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I called, and to the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my blood if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it declare your faithfulness? So again, we see David was secure in his kingdom. There had come a threat. He called out to the Lord, and the Lord had blessed him and delivered him. And then the praise of the Lord, verses 10 to 12. Hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and girded me with gladness, that my soul may sing praise to you and may not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. So these declarative praise psalms, as we said, identify exactly what the Lord has done. They proclaim what the Lord has done for the individual, and they praise the Lord in light of that. The final type of psalm, you can see Psalm 33, 36, 105, 111, 113, 117, or those are, declarative. Psalm 18, Psalm 30, 32, 34, 40, 106, 116, 138 can be characterized that way. Take a look at Psalm 136. And this will give us an example of the last type of psalm. This is a psalm of descriptive praise. This is one of my favorite psalms personally. The parts here are considerably simpler. You have three major parts. You have a call to praise, the cause of praise, and a renewed call to praise. So the call to praise here is in Psalm 136 is verses 1 through 3. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his loving kindness is everlasting. So you see that the psalmist has called the singers and the hearers, the readers, to praise. And then in verses 4 through 25, he lays out the reasons for that praise. And it's obviously here in demonstration of the fact that the loving kindness of the Lord is everlasting. So just to read a chunk, to him who alone does great wonders, to him who made the heavens with skill, to him who spread out the earth above the waters, to him who made the great lights. What's he talking about here? Creation, right? Verse 10, to him who smote the Egyptians in their firstborn and brought Israel out from their midst with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, to him who divided the Red Sea asunder and made Israel pass through the midst of it. What's he talking about here? He's talking about the Exodus, right? And not only that, but also then bringing them through the wilderness and into the land. To him who remembered us, in verse 23, in our low estate, and rescued us from our adversaries, who gives food to all flesh, for his loving kindness is everlasting. You see this renewed call to praise in the last verse, verse 26. Give thanks to the God of heaven, for his loving kindness is everlasting. So you see here God's character is brought to the fore. His loving kindness is everlasting. His loving kindness is everlasting. His loving kindness is everlasting. And examples of how God's faithfulness, his hesed love here, has been brought out in history in his actions. So the declarative praise psalms say, God, you've done this for me, and so I'm praising you for that. The descriptive praise psalms say, God, you are like this, so we are praising you for that, for your character. Right. And there's an element where what he's done brings out who he is. So, I don't want to make too great a separation here. There's more a personal element to this declarative praise as well. You've done this for me. But yes, the focus here in the descriptive praise is on the character of God, and generally in the declarative praise psalms, the actions of God come to the fore. So... So that's a good sampling of the different types of psalms. Within the descriptive praise, there are even subcategories there. You can go and look up if you want the connections there and the consistent themes. But I wanted to give you an idea of what you're looking for and what you're looking at in those. There are a couple of other types of psalms to be aware of. Songs of ascent. Psalm 120 to 134. You're right there in 136. You can look there. You see they're headed a song of ascents. These would have been sung as the people went to Jerusalem to gather for the feasts that they were supposed to go to, and they're called Psalms of Ascent because Jerusalem sits on the top of a hill, and as you went up, you would have sung these Psalms of Ascent, of going up, and the idea is that they're going up to the Lord. There are also several wisdom psalms, psalms where the main focus is the wisdom that comes. Psalm 1, how blessed is the man who does not walk, stand, or sit with the wicked, but instead makes his way to the assembly of the righteous. Psalm 119 is all about the scripture and the wisdom that comes from that. So be familiar and on the lookout for those other types of psalms as well. Some of the major themes that we see the sovereign God in the Psalms. We see the God of creation is sovereign. We see the God of Israel is sovereign. We see that he is God who is sovereign over the nation, who will establish his rule on the earth. Remember, what is the righteous man doing in the writings? He's looking for the establishment of the kingdom. And those who sing the Psalms and who believe the Psalms understand that that will be a time that will come with certainty. Friends and enemies are a major theme. The people of God, the righteous, the enemies of God, the wicked. God's attributes are brought out, his loyalty, his goodness, his loyalty, the word loving kindness. You will see that in Psalms over and over and over and over and over and over again. And there may not be a more rich word in all of the Old Testament than the Hebrew word chesed, which the New American Standard translates loving kindness, which is not really an English word. But they had to make up a word basically to try and translate it because it has the idea of God's kindness and his love, but specifically his kindness and love within the context of his faithfulness to the covenant and the promises that he's made. So God's attributes, his chesed, comes out often in the Psalms. His loving kindness is everlasting. His loving kindness is everlasting. His loving kindness is everlasting. Mercy, which gets a little part of it. Yeah, but it's such a big word that it's hard. So they made up a word in English to try and. Yeah, the computer doesn't like it, but God's goodness, his faithfulness, his righteousness, his compassion, all of these things come to the fore. Also, David is key within the Psalms and the Davidic covenant. David and the Davidic covenant are pretty important as you move through there. And you see on a regular basis that God is going to be faithful to his promise to David. Psalm 89 especially gets to that. The purpose of the book of the Psalms: the righteous pray to and praise Yahweh as they await the coming of God's kingdom. The Psalms was Israel's psalm book. It was their song book. By way of structure, you can take a look at interpretive problem number 1. Section G, are these individual expressions of spirituality, forms used in Israel's worship, or is it to be read as a book? Yes. And you can take a look at the structure in Psalms. And it breaks down each of the books. There are a few. That's what these, by the way, that's what these charts are. The authorship. And it's broken on, unfortunately, it broke into two different sections here. But it seems that there is some structure intended here in the book of Psalms, and the positioning and presence of Davidic Psalms seems to indicate that in particular. Exactly what that structure is intended to be is tricky. All right. So we finished Psalms out there. And that moves us into our last section of books. Those are the wisdom books. And we are coming up on 5 minutes till the hour. So we're going to go ahead and take a break here. Let's let's come back here in about 5 minutes. And I'm going to be real close on computer time. So it says I've got 50 minutes of battery remaining, and we're supposed to wrap up here in about 50 minutes. So we should get through to the end, though. So we'll come back here in about 5 minutes, maybe a little more than that, and we'll take a look at the structure of the wisdom literature and how this builds. We'll take a look then at several of the wisdom books, and we may get finished up next week. So, ready, break. Let's get back at it here with the wisdom books. The wisdom books. Can't remember. You guys on page 40 in your syllabi? Is that right? Okay. The meaning of wisdom. Now, there's a certain group of books that we're going to look into now that are often referred to as the wisdom books. And this makes up the bulk of the writings that fall under the wisdom literature. Excuse me. Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. All of these are generally classified under the heading or the title of wisdom literature. What does wisdom mean? Oftentimes we think of wisdom, and we think of Yoda, who is out here with this ethereal sort of understanding of the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, and someone who is wise, understands all these things, and knows the meaning of life and all of that kind of stuff. We have to be careful not to carry our current understanding of the meaning of the word into a scriptural understanding of the meaning of the word, because the Hebrews used the concept of chokmah, that's the Hebrew word for wisdom, differently than we generally do, or in a more nuanced way. The different ways that you see chokmah used, Oftentimes you see it employed in talking about someone who has skill in technical work. Someone who is able to do not menial tasks, but physical tasks. That's not the word at all I was trying to come up with. Physical tasks well. This person had wisdom. Someone who was able to do metalwork and woodwork. Someone who sewed, worked with cloth. Someone who made idols. Professional mourners, sailors. These men did, if they did their work well, if they were good at it, they were considered to be wise, considered to have wisdom. Okay, so a carpenter would be every bit as likely to be wise as a philosopher would. So you see, someone who has great skill in technical work would have wisdom. Also, someone who has skill in administration of state. Someone who is a good politician. We don't always associate, especially in our day, politicians with wisdom, but that's a skill set that is called wisdom if you're good at it. Joseph had wisdom in the way that he administrated Egypt and her resources. Tribal leaders were said to have wisdom. David was good at being a king, and so he had wisdom. Obviously, the personification in the Old Testament of wisdom, especially in this realm, would be Solomon. We talk about him with a great skill in leadership. Daniel was a good administrator as well. He worked his way very high up in the king's court in Babylon and then in Persia. So he is one who is seen as wisdom or as wise as well. So wisdom very often has more to do in the Bible with skill than it does with knowledge per se. Now, obviously, skill oftentimes requires knowledge, right? In order to be a good woodworker or metal worker, there's a certain knowledge that you have to have. In order to be a skilled administrator in state matters or even in business matters, you have to have a certain amount of knowledge and a certain amount of understanding about the way things are, about the way things work, and how you go about doing certain things. So there is knowledge involved here, but primarily in focus, primarily in view with Chokmah is skill and the ability to do something skillfully. So a basic definition, our working definition of wisdom is going to be the skill of being able to form and execute the correct plan to gain the desired results. Okay? The skill of being able to form and execute the correct plan to gain the desired results. And I like that definition. It's not my own. But I like that definition because it does bring a certain intellectual element. There's a certain knowledge that you have to be able to have. But it also brings out the element of being able to act upon that knowledge. So a skilled carpenter can know the type of shelf that he wants to build. He can look at a case or a cabinet or something like that. He says, I want to build a cabinet and I want it to be like this. And so not only is he able to draw up the plans and write all of that out and he knows how to make it, but then he's also able to execute the plans to an excellent degree. I've seen advertisements for it before. And he puts it together and builds amazing tree houses. Yeah. If you happen to watch the second half of the Super Bowl today after church, then you will see a wise football player. I think of Peyton Manning being able to understand. He looks at the field. He understands what's going on, maybe better than any other human being on the face of the planet. And not only has the understanding of what's happening, but also then the skill and the ability to exploit that and to use that to his advantage as a football player. So you have football wisdom played out there. But in a very real sense, that's the idea. That's the concept there. That's what's happening with wisdom. When we see Chokmah, then, wisdom in wisdom literature, there are a couple of things to make note of. It is divine in its source. Okay, it is divine in its source. It certainly comes from God. Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22 to 25 demonstrate that not only does wisdom come from God, but it is a characteristic of God. It says, "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way," Proverbs 8:22, "before his works of old. From everlasting I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth, when there were no depths, I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth." So it is divine in its origin, and it is a characteristic of the way that God works. Wisdom. It is also a source of life. Proverbs 3:18 says, "She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her," speaking of wisdom, "and happy are all those who hold fast to her." She's a tree of life, and she brings happiness, both fullness of life as well as the blessing of life. And wisdom is also inherently moral. Okay, it is inherently moral. Look at Proverbs 8, verses 8 and 9. "All the utterances of my mouth are in righteousness, and there is nothing crooked or perverted in them. They are all straightforward to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge." There is a tendency in thinking to say, okay, to separate action from understanding. And wisdom inherently is moral. There is inherently a moral element to wisdom. The one who is wise will act morally rightly. And the one who is doing what's morally right, by the way, is being wise. So there is an inherently moral aspect to wisdom. And this is important for people like me, it is available to all who will hear. We think of wisdom oftentimes, again, and because of some of the connotations that go along with it, people hear wisdom and they think, oh, this is for the intellectual elite to be wise. This is for the people who spend time at the top of mountains and caves for years on end, and they just sit there and contemplate their belly button. Wisdom is decidedly not that. It is decidedly not for some elite group. Not all are wise. There are certainly fools. But that's not because wisdom is something that's inaccessible or ungainable. Proverbs 1:20 and 21 say, "Wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city she utters her sayings. She says, 'How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? The scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you.'" So wisdom is accessible. That's the whole idea here, that it's there. It's there for the taking, and is happy to make itself available to any who will heed its wisdom. Wisdom's wisdom. Who will heed it. So it's not something that's inaccessible or far out there. It's something that is eminently accessible for any who will listen to its instruction. As far as the wisdom literature itself, there are a number of different types of wisdom literature that we will come across. We will see first of all, proverbial sayings. you'll see proverbial sayings, and these are sayings that make up the majority of the book of Proverbs. But did you know that the Proverbs in the book of Proverbs don't start until chapter 10? You come to chapters 1 through 9 really prepare the reader to enter into the world of the Proverbs. They're called to listen, to heed, and to follow the instruction of wisdom and the Proverbs. We see in chapter 10, verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon. A wise son makes his father glad, but a foolish son is a grief to his mother. So you have proverbial sayings there. They're short, pithy sayings that give, that communicate wisdom for life. By pithy, I mean they get to the heart of the issue in a very condensed, seedling sort of way. There are moral exhortations as well within the wisdom literature. These are longer sections that compel the listener to do right, to follow wisdom. This Psalm or Proverbs 1 through 9 would fall into this category, where that section or the sections there exhort the listener, exhort the reader to do right and to follow wisdom. And then there is extended wisdom discourse, entire pieces of literature intended to communicate wisdom. Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon would all fall under this category.
Dr. MacArthur's used that too. I think I found where he got it from. It's a history of the United States by a person named Johnson. I'll have to bring that book sometime. I think I discovered, where did he get that expression? I think I may have found it.
Yeah, I've heard the expression around occasionally. The wisdom books. We noted that there are some wisdom psalms out there. Psalm 1, Psalm 119, Psalm 37. But we've covered those to some degree. Job falls under the wisdom books. Proverbs obviously falls under the wisdom books. Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature as well. Some of the characteristics of wisdom literature: it addresses the individual. So wisdom literature pulls the son aside and says, listen up. It is addressed to the individual. The authority in wisdom literature is moral experience and trained intelligence. It says, this is the way that the world is, and I've seen it happen. I've seen the way that the world works. Now, obviously, the men who write the wisdom literature are inspired, so there is a godly authority here as well. But God has trained the men who write these works in the ways of life. And I like this description. The concern of the wisdom books is the workday world, right? It's how you go about day after day at work or in retirement, Steve.
Yes.
So, but the workday world, how life functions, is covered in the wisdom literature. And the method is counsel and instruction. The imploration, the implorement of the book of Proverbs is, listen, son, I'm going to give you counsel, and I'm going to instruct you in the way that the world works and how you ought to function in light of that. So that'll get us ready here for the wisdom books. Let's start in on Job. All right, the book of Job is called Job because it's about Job. Yeah, very good. All right. You guys are sharp bunch here. Doesn't take you long, does it? Yeah. The date, not exactly sure when Job was written, but we can put some parameters on when the events take place. We would place the events of the book of Job between 1800 and 1500 BC, so we're talking about during the patriarchal period. Remember, when does Abraham live? Roughly 2000 BC, yep. And so those guys lived for a long time, so you're talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph into Israel, and then the Exodus happens in about 1445 BC, so 1500 if you want to round it off to a really round number. So you're talking sometime between Isaac and the Exodus in that patriarchal period. And we see a couple of things that would point us in this direction. First of all, the lands that are mentioned. The lands of Uz and Buz. There was a man in the land. Boy, you talk about rhyming, tongue twister a little bit. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And more from Buz. And Genesis 21 or 22:21 talks about Uz and Buz. So you're talking about people who lived in that area. You also have the land of Sheba, mentioned in Genesis 25:3. So again, remember what's going on. Genesis 22, right around where Abraham offers Isaac for sacrifice, to give you an idea of where you are in the narrative of Genesis. Genesis 25, shortly after that, talking about Sheba. So the lands that are mentioned in Job seem to be present in the narrative in Genesis. You also see a patriarchal lifestyle. Look at Job 1:5. It came about when the days of feasting had completed their cycle that Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. So it is an acceptable practice for a godly man to get up in the morning and to go out his front door and offer sacrifices, burnt offering sacrifices. So it's not as if the appropriate worship is centered in Israel or Jerusalem or anything like that. So you're dealing with a patriarchal lifestyle. Also, Job's lifespan would seem to indicate that we are in a patriarchal period. Remember, we already mentioned that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, those guys lived a long, long time. And the same is true with Job. He lives, I should remember this number off the top of my head, but I don't. It's 150 years or something like that. Maybe longer than that. 140 years. After this, Job lived 140 years. So it would have been longer. You're talking a long, long time. But that would be consistent with the lifespan of the patriarchs as well. They live 100, 180 years, something like that. So Job died an old man full of days. So his lifespan also points to this time period. Yeah, you're talking 4 generations later. You've got an old man. The writing then we would place sometime obviously after Job, but before the time of the monarchy. So I realize that's a pretty wide range of dates, but it's in there somewhere. We don't. Nope, that's one of the things that we do not know. Maybe Job himself. It was. Yep. So there is some supernatural understanding given. into the events. Major themes in the book of Job. The righteous man Job, who is the suffering servant of the Lord. He is one who is not guilty, is the idea. There is a good bit of legal terminology given in the book of Job, or used in the book of Job. There are lots of court words used to demonstrate, to point out Job's innocence. What we see in light of this is that Job is not guilty, and that he, here come the hiccups. Job is not guilty, and he has a case. In fact, he wants to make his case before the Lord. That is Job's desire, is I want to be a plaintiff in God's court. Look, I don't deserve this. I'm not guilty of anything here. And that's going to be important. He's right. Because we see that his quote-unquote comforters, his friends, their folly is to say, look, clearly you're guilty of something here because this kind of thing doesn't happen to someone who isn't guilty. And Job's response is, I'm not guilty. I would call for a case before the Lord's court. Job is not guilty, and his friends, on the other hand, are guilty. So there is a good bit of legal terminology that comes out to demonstrate Job's innocence, even though he's suffering. And a large part of the point here is that Job is not suffering because he's guilty, because he stands condemned before the Lord, but because of God's sovereign hand. The attack against Job, a major element of the book as well. It is by Satan. Satan accuses Job before the throne of God of being obedient simply because God has blessed him. Simply because God has blessed him. Satan comes into the throne room of God and says, I am looking for someone to give a hard time to. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? He is a righteous man, more righteous than any man on the face of the earth. And Satan says, well, of course he's a righteous man, God. You have done all these things for him. You've given him great blessing. You have given him health and many children and all sorts of possessions. So he says, Satan accuses him of being obedient because of the blessing that he has received. He also accuses Job of being obedient simply because God has given him his health. But God says Job's righteousness is not on account of any of these things. We also see, though, that the attack that Satan brings against Job is by the direction of the Lord. That's one of the difficult things about the book. It's one of the major truths, actually, in the book, is that this has come by the direction of the Lord. And I already noted this. It's God who brings God who brings Job to Satan's attention. And he allows Satan to go so far, only so far. We also see that Job is attacked by his three friends. While Job is indeed righteous, and that is a consistent theme of the book, that Job is a righteous man, they all conclude that he's guilty because he's suffering. So they look and see what's happening to Job, and they say, Job, clearly you are not righteous because otherwise these things wouldn't be happening to you. And all of this points to the fact that God is the one who's sovereign over what's going on. I think that really gets to the heart of the book. We have to understand that even in suffering, even when the righteous man suffers, it's under the sovereign hand of God. That God is in control of what's going on and that he has a purpose for what's happening. We see that he is the creator and he is also the control of the universe. Because what does God ultimately come to Job and say? Yeah, he says, look, I'm the one who's in control here. I understand that you're not guilty of anything, but you are speaking where you have no right. So he doesn't even come to Job and say, look, Job, this is what's going on. Satan came to me and is looking for somebody righteous, and he brought accusation against you, and this is in order to prove that your righteousness is beyond the blessing that I've given you, is beyond the health that you have maintained. He says, sit down and listen to me for just a minute, son. I'm gonna tell you. I'm gonna tell you who's really in charge. And it's not you. So that leads us to the purpose. The response of the righteous man to suffering must be worship of and submission to the Lord. That's the idea here. That's the picture of the book of Job. It's that the wise response to suffering is to understand that God is the one who is sovereign. He is in control. And so I will worship and submit to Yahweh, regardless of whether I think I deserve to suffer or not. You can take a look at your chart here, Job, and you can see the structure of the book. The first 2 chapters give emphasis in prologue or in prose. They pull back the curtain to what's gone on before the events of the book in heaven. And you have the discussion between God and Satan, as God explained, or as we see emphasized here, Job's impeccable character. And God is the one who brings that about. He's the one who brings that to Satan's attention. And so what we have established at the beginning of the book is that Job is not suffering because he's done something to deserve it. But Job will suffer because it is part of God's sovereign plan for this to happen. Then you have the discourses in poetical form. There is a discussion, there are several discussions in fact, on why Job has suffered. There's discussion given on why Job has suffered. And Job's friends all take their cracks. And then beginning in Job 38, God says, this is why Job has suffered, because I'm sovereign and I said so, is what it really comes down to. And then at the very end, the epilogue is again in prose. You have Job's vindication. There is proof positive again here that Job has not suffered because he deserved to suffer or because of some sinfulness that was found in him. And God makes that clear by restoring him and blessing him beyond where he had been even in the past. Yeah. Here's what we're going to do. What did we cover today? Let's go ahead and do Proverbs, and then next week maybe. No, that'll put us in a good spot. We may wrap up a little early next week as we finish out. Maybe not. Anytime I think that we'll have time to wrap up early, that doesn't work. So let's go ahead and move through Proverbs here quickly. We should be able to get Proverbs in 10 minutes here. The book of Proverbs excuse me. Is a collection of pithy sayings that demonstrate and model for us wisdom. The title in Hebrew is the Proverbs of. In the Septuagint, it's called the Proverbs of Solomon. The Vulgate then translates that, the book of Proverbs. So what we have primarily in the book of Proverbs are pithy statements that are proverbial, that state wisdom. Yeah, that is profound, right? A book full of proverbial statements in the book of Proverbs. We have several dates again for the book of Proverbs. Between 970 and 931, you would have the Proverbs of Solomon. That would be his adult life. But not all of the Proverbs are Solomon's Proverbs. You also in 690 BC have a final collection of Proverbs in the days of Hezekiah, and then there are a few other men who add Proverbs in as well. So in 690 BC, in the biggest chunk are the Proverbs that were written by and or gathered by Solomon. Hezekiah in 690 BC has assigned some men to gather up some of the other Proverbs that Solomon wrote, and then that gives us another chunk of Proverbs, and then there are a few Proverbs that are written by other individuals. Some of the major themes here. First of all, the God of Proverbs. And we think of Proverbs as a very earthly book, a book that is very much taken with what goes on in everyday life. But the wise man understands everyday life in light of the character and the nature and the action of the Lord. 10% of the verses in the book of Proverbs mention God directly. There is a chart here. I think it's in your charts. It's right above the chiasms there. There's a chart here that pulls out all of the different characteristics of the Lord that the different Proverbs bring out. He's the creator of the cosmos. He's the creator of mankind. He will avenge what's wrong. Knows man's ways. He's directs history. He withholds and gives rain and plenty. He disciplines his children, answers prayer. He's merciful, wise. He delights in justice. He hates iniquity. So you see all of these things laid out, the charts of, or in that chart, the different attributes of God that are brought to the fore. You can see here as well, God is sovereign. He is man's maker. He is man's blesser, and he is man's judge. Really brought to the fore in the book of Proverbs, and as it outlines the character of God. We also see that the wisdom of Proverbs deals a great deal with man before God. So man as he stands in relationship to the Lord. He is a rebel. He needs to trust God. All men are the same before the Lord. These are all brought to the fore as man stands before the Lord. Man's personal conduct is brought to the fore. Man's conduct in general is important in the Proverbs. Man in society and how he relates to other men is a source of wisdom, or is a source for wisdom. In his family life, a man with his wife, a man and his children, and particularly disciplining them. A man before kings, a man and his neighbors, a man and his money, the way that he functions in relation to society around him and the people who are around him is a matter for wisdom. So not only how he conducts himself, not only his standing before God or how he conducts himself in general, but also how he relates to the people who are around him. These are all matters that wisdom speaks to. and that he needs to live skillfully in light of these things. You can see an outworking of his conduct in general, his diligence, the need for using his speech well, for humility, for controlling his temper, the benefits of joyfulness in his life and in his thinking. As far as his relationship to his wife, we see that his choice is vital. Choosing a good wife is a huge blessing, and choosing a bad one is a huge bane. As far as with his children, a wise man, both instructs and disciplines his children. You see a great deal of wisdom there. Again, how he relates to kings and standing before them, how he relates to his neighbors, how he relates to his money as well. The purpose of Proverbs, the young naive son is given exhortation and instruction in the ways of wisdom. And you can see there is something of an outline that we can take. You have an introduction at the very beginning, the first 7 verses, the admonition to acquire wisdom in chapters 1 through chapter 9, the Proverbs of Solomon and of the wise men in chapters 10 through 29, and some final words from Agur and from Lemuel, and the description of the excellent wife in Proverbs 30 and 31. So Proverbs is a little tough to take as a big chunk because by nature of what a proverb is, it's short, it's pithy, it stands on its own. Sometimes there are some chunks of Proverbs that are grouped together by theme, but there's not necessarily a hugely logical flow as we move through Proverbs. So that's the book of Proverbs and the wisdom literature. With that, we'll kick you loose. Next week we will go ahead and meet at our regular time.